Uh, this is Steve Lockwood. I'm the president of the Historical Society. We're looking forward to a great year this year. Hopefully, of course, it'll be in person instead of via Zoom that we're kind of restricted to now because of city requirements. I just want to remind you, those who have joined us this evening, of a couple of our key achievements from last year. One was, as you may recall, we completed research that we sponsored on pre-Columbian history of Lake Worth, commissioned from Dorothy Block, focusing on the Jaga Indian mounds. A paper based on her compilation of the findings is on our website. She's probably going to publish it herself, and I think that was very useful. The other thing that many of you were aware of course, was the completion and the mounting of the Jewel mural commemorating the Jewel post office, and I think most of you, certainly on this call, and most of our members and board attended the dedication, which we postponed from last spring to this fall in order to be able to do it in person. It was a tremendous success, moderated by Ted. And we had comments from a wide range of participants and supporters, including the artist Tracy Rosef Peterson, city officials, community representatives, funders, and so on. And for your information, there is a YouTube video that if you Google Lake Worth Jewel mural dedication, you'll find there's 3 YouTube videos of the activity, but taking place that took place over about an hour. And I'll just, in terms of going forward this season, we're lining up an exciting set of speakers starting with this evening. In January, we're going to have a presentation on the famous Lake Worth architect G. Sherman Childs, who designed many of the most important public buildings in the 20s and 30s, including Lake Worth City Hall Annex, also the castle and birthday houses, most of the major churches, a number of Art Deco houses. Then in February, in conjunction with Black History Month, we're looking forward to a presentation from Charlene Farrington, who's the director of the Spady Cultural Heritage Museum in Delray Beach, which is dedicated to Black history, African-American history, and the heritage of Palm Beach County. And I'm sure that will be very stimulating and interesting. And we have other presentations lined up for the remainder of the year. Let me now move to introduce tonight's speaker. Just to mention, the presentation will be about a half hour. We'll have Q&A following. Of course, anybody who's been a reader of the Palm Beach Post in recent years is familiar with Eliot Kleinberg. He is a native of South Florida, and he spent 30 years of his half century in reporting at the Post before retiring last year. And as many of you know, he was a general reporter, but importantly for our purposes, a feature writer and a longtime columnist focusing on all things Florida, Floridiana, and of course, weird Florida. And as he tells it, his editors at the Palm Beach Post had the idea for a weekly column because they figured that most of their readers have been residents in Florida, as Eliot puts it, for about 10 minutes. So anything they learned about local history was news, and that was the genesis of Eliot's a column, Post Time. And a quote about some of his columns that I love is as follows: "Anytime you jam descendants of slaves, rednecks, Indians, con artists, carpetbaggers, drug smugglers, fugitive, UFO abductees, strippers, alligators, and political refugees into a flat peninsula surrounded by water, but with hardly a drop to drink anymore, you get a pretty weird place." So that gives you a sense of what we may hear about tonight. But I think it's also important to note that in addition to Mr. Kleinberg's journalism, somehow he's found time to write more than a dozen books, mostly focusing on Florida. They include Black Cloud, on the great 1928 Okeechobee hurricane, a book on Florida during World War II, and 2 weird Florida books based on his post columns. And his latest book, Peace River, I guess, is somewhat of a departure, as it's a historical novel based on the end of the Civil War. Now, I don't know exactly what aspects of Florida history he's going to talk about this evening, but I'm sure it's going to be both enlightening and entertaining. So, Eliot, take it away.
Hello, everybody. I hope you're having a great holiday season. I can tell you that I very much am enjoying retirement. But I am, of course, I still have a very strong place in my heart for the Palm Beach Post and for local newspapers in general, who I fear are under tremendous pressure right now financially all over the country. And I tell people that they need to think long and hard about what their community would be like without a local newspaper, and to do everything they can to support the local newspaper, because there's a million places where you can get national news, but if there's no local paper, there are 0 places where you're going to get local news. So that's my rant. Tonight, I'm talking about the best of post time, which, as Steve said, was my column that ran in the Palm Beach Post for 21 years. We did more than 1,000 columns. So that's something about which I'm very proud. And I promised Steve that before I did anything else, I would do a few Lake Worth things. So the first one is Buddy Epson, who, as everybody knows, is from Lake Worth. But I found out he's not from Lake Worth. My colleague, Scott Iman, interviewed him in, I think, 2001. And Buddy said, no, he didn't live in Lake Worth. He lived on Worth Avenue in Palm Beach. And his father was taught dancing at the Breakers and the Royal Poinciana. Now, we all know the story about how Buddy Epson was supposed to be on The Wizard of Oz as the Tin Man. But he was allergic to the dust, the makeup, the aluminum-based makeup that they used for the Tin Man costume. So that was our Lake Worth superstar, except he wasn't. Now, this place you know about, that's Lake Worth, except it's actually Lantana, but it's close enough, right? That's the National Enquirer Christmas tree. Remember that? When Generoso Pope moved down from New Jersey in 1971, he loved the warm weather, but he missed the traditions of the Christmas tree. So he ordered this 45-foot tree, and of course people started driving by, and pretty soon it was causing traffic jams. And when it reached 117 feet in 1979, 117 feet, and was listed in the Book of World Records, which sadly, after Pope passed away, that was pretty much the end of the tree. Now, I got one more Lake Worth story to tell you. This really did happen in Lake Worth, and you folks will recognize the location. That, of course, is the old Oakley Theater. Well, what I discovered when I was doing a little research is that back in the 1960s, it was a different kind of theater. Nowadays, you know, the amount of adult material that any teenager can watch on his cell phone while he's waiting for his school bus. But back then, if you wanted to watch that kind of stuff, you had to go to one of these theaters with your hat pulled low over your eyes and hope nobody recognized you. So this theater, which you all recognize as the Oakley, in the 60s, does anybody know what it was called? It was called the Play Toy. And in 1969, it was the target of a full court press by the Lake Worth City Commission. Sorry, Mayor. To remove smut from the city, which they called the skin flick capital of the world. So Lake Worth was on the map. They had 2 raids. They put policemen in the parking lot with cameras, which didn't have any film in them. The idea was just to intimidate people. And then the theater played Deep Throat, which of course is the most notorious uh, movie of its time. And the authorities rushed in and arrested all the employees. And they dropped all the charges except on one employee. He paid a small fine, and the theater was shut down. It then became, everybody, Lake Worth Playhouse, 300-seat venue for live and generally clothed performances. Now, I'm sure you guys know the original history, which I looked up, which was that Lucian and Clarence Oakley bought it for $150,000 in 1924. That's $150,000. And of course, we know that Lucian Oakley committed suicide, and that supposedly his ghost haunts the theater. So that's just about my favorite Lake Worth story. You can imagine. I found a picture in the paper of these guys, these plainclothes detectives walking into the courthouse with movie reels under their arms. So, as I told you, Post Time lasted for 21 years, and you can see I went from Darth Vader to Mr. Rogers, and this is originally why it was called Post Time. And those of you folks who are old timers will remember a guy named Bob Balfe, and he did a sports column that he called Post Time. And then I also was playing off, time and history and everything else. But also, as you remember, the Palm Beach Post originally had an afternoon paper called the Evening Times. And I always knew the people that were old timers if they said, "Oh, you work at the Post Times." So we did Post Time, and remarkably, I was able to come out with 2 books based on collections of my columns. The first was just sort of a greatest hits, but the other one was I just did a collection of my columns just about Palm Beach County in the 20s and 30s, which was a remarkable time of rum runners, prohibition, the real estate boom. Really an amazing time, which is why I loved writing about it. Now, first question, of course, is going to be, we all know, how did Palm Beach get its name? Well, this is the Providencia, 175-ton brig that was heading from Trinidad to Cadiz, Spain. And on January 9th, 1878, it grounded on what was the shore of Palm Beach, which at the time only had probably about 25 people. And they called it the Lake Worth region because they called the lake Lake Worth. Well, in the cargo were thousands and thousands of coconuts. So the crew needed to get off the sandbar, so they sold the coconuts to the residents at salvage costs of 2.5 cents each. And of course, the residents went and they planted all the coconuts, and pretty soon the place was crawling with palm trees, and that's why they call it Palm Beach. Now, because it's December, I'm going to ask the question. I'm now going to talk about the next town that has an unusual origin name, which of course is Boca Raton. Now, if you look on this map, you will see Boca Raton. See it surrounded by the circle. The actual name of the area was Boca de los Ratones, which means mouth of the mice, not rats. And supposedly, according to the legend, this was where the sharp rocks of the inlet had damaged the ropes that were holding the Spanish ships at shore. But here's the problem. The real Boca de los Ratones was in Miami. And the map makers messed it up. One of many government goofs. Sorry, Mayor. Now, did it ever snow in Palm Beach County? Yes. Yeah, January of 1977. So I'll tell you sort of a personal story. Being born and raised in South Florida, I didn't see snow until I was 21 years old. I was a student at the University of Florida, and my fraternity organized a ski trip to North Carolina. So we went up to North Carolina to go skiing, and I finally saw snow. I was all excited. We drive back to Gainesville, and it's snowing. And I called my dad down in Miami. I said, "You're not going to believe this. I went all the way to North Carolina to finally see snow, and it's snowing here in Gainesville." And my dad said, "Well, guess what's going on in Miami?" Now, what a lot of people might not remember is that while the snow was a very exciting event and everybody got a lot of mileage out of it, it was followed by one of the most vicious cold snaps in the history of South Florida. Damage was just in the billions. And my sister-in-law, who lives up in the Chicago area, she always says, "Oh, big deal. It got down to 28 in Florida. We get down to 28 here in Chicago all the time." I said, "Pam, what you don't understand is that in Florida, when it gets down to 28, you're about to pay $9 for a glass of orange juice." Now, everyone knows who this guy is. John Ashley. He's just about my favorite historical criminal. Now, the guy on the left, of course, is Sheriff Baker. And there were two Sheriff Bakers, father and son. And Ashley went after both of them. He would taunt them by placing a bullet at the teller's window. And eventually, it got so bad that Sheriff Baker said Ashley had lost one of his eyes during a bank robbery. He tried to shoot out the window of his car. The bullet hit the frame, came back, hit him in the eye, and he had to wear a glass eye. And so Ashley would put this bullet on the teller's window to taunt the sheriff, and the sheriff would say, "You know what? One day I'm going to have your glass eye on my keychain." So these guys were playing for keeps. And in fact, one day, Baker got a tip that Ashley and several of his gang members were on the way to Jacksonville. They were going to try to slip into Georgia and stay in Georgia until things cooled down in South Florida. So they went up to what's now St. Lucie County, and they ran a chain across a bridge, a very small bridge on US 1. And the Ashley gang pulled up. The sheriff's deputies came out and said, "Give yourself up." And supposedly they were handcuffing them. And the next thing you know, all four members of the Ashley gang were shot face down on the bridge while escaping. Now, the thing is, you got to remember that not a lot of people wept for the Ashleys because they really were bad dudes. And I talk about, when I've talked about the Ashleys, I talk about the danger of romanticizing criminals. Now, these guys were around in the 20s, which was a very exciting time because Prohibition was on, and the police were the bad guys, and the rum runners were the good guys. So guys like Ashley were good guys, but of course, really, they were thugs and criminals and murderers. And you always have to remember that. You have to avoid the tendency to romanticize them. This is probably the most underappreciated historical figure in Palm Beach County. His name is Cracker Johnson. And Cracker Johnson was the king of Black West Palm Beach in the 40s and 50s. Now, of course, you've got to remember that in the 40s and 50s, the black neighborhoods had, by necessity, were their own closed system. They had their own banks, they had their own restaurants, they had their own clothing shops, they had their own pharmacies. And Cracker Johnson pretty much owned all of them. Now, they called him Cracker because he had very light skin and he could pass for a white man if he wanted to. But I came across this picture, and it looks fake, doesn't it? It looks like a movie picture. As a historian, well, let me put it this. As a journalist, it's bothersome that newspapers did not write about Black people. They were invisible for much of the 20th century. As a historian, I'm very frustrated by the fact that they almost never wrote about Cracker Johnson. Cracker Johnson was in the paper 3 times: when he was arrested, when he was murdered, and when he was buried. And I'm sure that had he been a white celebrity, he'd have been in the paper a lot more. And that's a loss for me as a historian because I can hardly find anything out about him. This is the Pine Ridge Hospital. It was a hospital for Blacks, and it was near downtown West Palm Beach. And at the time, if you were Black and you wanted to go to the hospital, you couldn't go to Good Sam. In fact, blacks in 5 counties, if they wanted to get to a hospital or they needed to get to a hospital, they had to go to that place. Some of you may remember Lake Lytle. Lake Lytle, of course, was a commissioner in the 60s. And we all know Lake Lytle Jr., Lake Lytle III. You know, people see the law firm's commercials and they don't realize the original Lake Lytle. And what I like about Lake Lytle is that he was a good old boy from Louisiana. He came down here to South Florida, and things were changing. The civil rights movement was happening, and things were changing. And one Friday, when Lake Lytle was chairman of the Palm Beach County Commission, which of course at the time, everything was operated out of the old county courthouse, he called in his chief maintenance manager. And he said, Jimmy, I'm going to pay your crew overtime. I want you to come in this weekend, and everywhere it says colored men and colored women, I want you to paint over where it says colored. And on Monday morning, everybody came in, and the bathrooms just said men and women. And of course, nobody wanted to say anything. And that's how Lake Lytle quietly integrated the Palm Beach County Courthouse. It doesn't always have to be a big confrontation. Later, of course, they named the park Lake Lytle Park. And Lake Lytle, who I think was in his 60s, had promised that he would jump off the diving board. There he is. Guy Metcalf might be the most tragic public figure in the history of Palm Beach County. He came down, he moved, there was a newspaper called The Tropical Sun that operated up on the Space Coast. But Metcalf saw that the future was in West Palm Beach, Lake Worth area. So he brought his whole newspaper down and he started publishing down here. Eventually, he was part of the movement to split off Palm Beach County from what was then Dade County. And he was the first public school superintendent. Well, one day, he was confronted by other officials who said there was a discrepancy in the accounting books. And it was pretty significant. Metcalf went over to the school board headquarters, walked into the vault, and shot himself. So we'll never know whether he was guilty or not. Now, everybody knows who this is. Everybody. And a lot of people might not remember that Flagler had to pretty much get talked into coming down to Palm Beach. He came down to St. Augustine to take his wife. She had tuberculosis. And this happened with a lot of people. You know, the warm weather supposedly would help. And he loved St. Augustine. And he wasn't going to extend his railroad all the way down to what was called the Lake region because he didn't want to hack through jungles. Well, there was a lady named Julia Tuttle down in what's now Miami, one of his men came down to Miami, and she sent him back to St. Augustine to Flagler with a box of orange blossoms. St. Augustine had 2 horrific freezes. And so these orange blossoms were her way of saying, if you keep going with your railroad, it'll be worth your while because we are frost free. Now, the rest of the story is that she gave him half of downtown Miami. Well, when he opened the Royal Poinciana Hotel in Palm Beach in April of 1894, you couldn't get there yet. You had to take a boat to a train, to a train, to a boat, to a train to get there. And then he finally extended the railroad into Palm Beach County, which wasn't Palm Beach County yet. And in fact, the first bridge across the lake was not a motor bridge. It was a railroad spur because the rich people had their own railroad cars because they had so much clothing. They had to have their own railroad car for all their clothing. So he built a railroad spur so they could get all their clothes over to the hotel. We've all heard the story of the Styx. And when I was writing the history column, this was one of my crusades, because there are people who will swear up and down that the story of the Sticks is true, and it's not. The story, as you know, is that the Sticks was a squatters area at the north end of Palm Beach, and that one day Flagler brought a circus to the mainland and gave everybody in the Sticks free tickets to the circus. And while they were in the circus, he burned down their houses. Now, as a journalist, I would love for this story to be true. It's a great story, but it's not true. You go back and you look at the clips, including the old tropical sun, and we know that these people were forced to leave because this was a squatters area. They weren't paying any rent. These were all people that were working on the hotels, and it wasn't owned by Flagler. It was owned by other developers who told the people in the Sticks, "You have 2 weeks to get out." And after they left, then bulldozers knocked down all the houses and set them on fire. And that's where the story came from. But it's not true. The legend is just not true. And of all the things I fought to dispel, the fake news, this was probably number one. We know who this is, Burt Reynolds. And the interesting thing about Burt Reynolds is, of course, that he went up to Florida State University. I think it was only the second or third year they played football, which, I'm a Gator, so that's fine with me. But he was their star halfback until he blew out his knee. Then he came down here, didn't know what he wanted to do, and he went to Palm Beach State College. And he ran into Watson Duncan, and the next thing you know, the guy was a movie star. And he never forgot his hometown or his home area. He bought that ranch up in Jupiter. He brought shows down here to film so that he could hire locals. He donated all sorts of things, and he really was a good son of Palm Beach County. Now, some of you might know this guy. His name is Gus Jordan, and Gus ran a place called Gus's Baths on Palm Beach, and he was a former soldier from Denmark. And he worked as a lifeguard in Palm Beach, and he also was the first police officer on the island, on the town of Palm Beach. And people would ask him, "How many people have you saved from drowning?" And he said, "All I could, kid." Now, of course, these days, you get in trouble for riding a turtle, but Gus got away with it. And who was going to argue with him, right? Okay, if you look on the far right, you see who that is? John Kennedy. The Kennedy family, of course, had a compound on Palm Beach for many decades. And even after Kennedy was elected president, he came down here as president-elect. And this is a story that many people don't know. A retired postal worker from New England followed him down. And the trunk of his car was full of dynamite. And he was going to wait for Kennedy to step out of his house and ram him and blow him up. So he was all ready to do it, and Kennedy stepped out, but he had his wife and children with him. So the bomber got cold feet. And before he had a chance to try again, they caught him. Kennedy is not the only president. Well, first of all, you guys know about the bunker, right? In Peanut Island. Kennedy never went there. They were still working on it when he was killed. And of course, now there's a huge debate on who's going to save this bunker, who's going to upkeep it. It's, for the longest time, it was owned by the county, and then it was owned by the Lake Worth Navigation District. So I don't know what the latest is. Now, this is Mar-a-Lago. Another president lived here, as you know. Originally, you probably know that Marjorie Merriweather Post built Mar-a-Lago. All right, I want to get this right because it's a lot of money. She inherited $11 million from her father, who was the Post cereal guy, and she built the hotel, the house, for $2.5 million. That's in 1920s dollars. It had 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms with gold fixtures, 3 bomb shelters, an 1,800 square foot living room. I think that's almost as big as my house. A 1,500 square foot dining room, a theater, a 75-foot tower, 36,000 tiles, and a 9-hole golf course. In 1964, she decided that she was going to give the house to the federal government. But the federal government didn't want to pay the upkeep on it. It was a very expensive house to maintain. When she died in 73, the federal government got it, and they were looking for anybody to get it off, take it off their hands, and everybody knows who did. 1985, Donald Trump. Later, Trump went to the Palm Beach Town Council and said, you know, it costs me $1 million a year to maintain this house. And it's costing too much. So you have to change the zoning and let me change it into a private club. And if you don't, I'll knock it down. You can find me all you want. I'm going to knock it down. So the town council said, well, when you put it that way, I guess we'll change the zoning. So you got to change to a private club. And in its own way, that saved Mar-a-Lago. People ask me what's the greatest crime, single crime that ever occurred in Palm Beach County. And this has got to be it. You folks probably have recognized Judge Chillingworth. This was in 1955. Every time I wrote about these guys, I called it the crime of the century. And nobody ever challenged me. Chillingworth, of course, was a judge, circuit judge. At the time, Palm Beach County was so sparsely populated. I mean, now Palm Beach County is its own circuit. Back then, Palm Beach and Broward were one circuit, and they only had 3 judges. And Chillingworth was one of them. He was a circuit judge, and Joe Peel was a magistrate judge. They did little things. Well, what people didn't know is that Peel was in the numbers racket and the Bolita and private secret gambling and liquor places. And the cops would come to him and ask him to sign the search warrants to go bust the speakeasies. And as soon as the cops left, he'd pick up the phone and he'd call and he'd say, get out of there, the cops are coming. Well, Peel got in trouble, not because of that. He represented somebody in a divorce case and messed it up, and she found out she was a bigamist. And so Chillingworth was going to get Judge Peel's Florida bar ticket yanked, which would have kicked him off the bench. So Peel hired a couple of his goons to kidnap Chillingworth from a house. He had a weekend getaway cottage in Manalapan, which back then was there were probably 100 people on that whole stretch of Manalapan. So they were going to come and kidnap him and take him out into the ocean and dump him overboard and drown him. When they got there, Marjorie was there too. And so, unfortunately, they drowned her too. And Chillingworth's disappearance was unsolved for years. No body, nothing. They don't know what happened. Until finally one of the henchmen squealed and Judge Peel went to prison. Judge Peel denied his involvement to his dying day. Now, this is a story that I want to tell you about because the fall guys in this story are the Palm Beach Post. This is a house up in West Palm that claims to be the oldest house in West Palm. There's another house that's older, but it's been renovated and additions have been attached to it. So these guys claim to be the oldest house still in its original format. And it was owned by a guy named Richard Hone. Well, I went back through the clips, and in the 80s, the people who owned the house at the time, which were the third people, there had been somebody in between, and then these people had bought it in the 60s. And the reporter said, well, who was Mr. Hone? And they said, well, the way we heard it is that Hone was a British expatriate, and he was writing a letter to his sister back in England. And somebody fired a bullet through the window and shot him in the head and killed him. And a mysterious man on horseback got away. I said, oh, okay, well, I don't know. I need to look into this. Well, of course, the Palm Beach Post wasn't around until 1916, and any stories over the decades always told the same legend about a mysterious man on horseback. But I remembered that there were two papers that were around in 1903, and one of them was the Lake Worth. No, you guys got to help me out here. It wasn't the Weekly Lake Worth. It was another Lake Worth paper that was out of business by, like, I think 1914. And the Weekly Lake Worth News and the Tropical Sun, which I already mentioned. Well, they covered the heck out of it. And it wasn't a mysterious guy on horseback. It was an employee of Richard Hone, claimed to be, confessed to the murder, and he said he was going to rob him. Now, here's the interesting part of the story. I was able to track down a man in France, a British expatriate running a vineyard in France, who was the grandson of Richard Hone's cousin, which is pretty close. And I said, well, the story is that he was writing a letter to his sister, and the man says, yes, I've seen the letter. I said, oh, please tell me you still have it. He said, no one knows what happened to it. But on the letter, you see him writing, and all of a sudden the pen goes, scream. Oh, I would have killed for that letter. I got one more, and then I'm going to open it up to questions and comments because they told me to keep it. You guys told me to keep it around 30 minutes. And that is, there's the Lake Worth News. A dastardly deed. Look at that. This is Jack Roland Murphy. His nickname was Murph the Surf. And in October of 1964, two men broke into the American Museum of Natural History and made off with jewels worth about $3 million in today's dollars. And one of them was Murph the Surf Murphy. And one of the diamonds, one of the jewels that was stolen was something called the DeLong ruby. It was 100 carats. So it later got fenced. But the problem was the fence didn't know what to do with this thing because everybody would recognize it. So a freelance journalist in Palm Beach County somehow tracked down this fence and found out that he knew where the diamond was and that he was willing to ransom it for $25,000. A lot of money in 1964. So then they had to find somebody who could come up with $25,000. Well, it was easy. John D. MacArthur, the man who built Palm Beach Gardens, the multimillionaire. So he said, okay, I'll give the $25,000. So the instructions were, drive out to the Florida's Turnpike, Lake Worth entrance. Go to the Lake Worth Service Plaza, go to the first phone booth, and that's it. So John D. MacArthur and this reporter go to the phone booth, and the phone's ringing. They pick up the phone, and a guy says, reach up over your head. And there was the ruby. So the DeLong ruby recovered in Lake Worth. I could go on and on. I've got more stuff, but I know you guys wanted me to kind of give you just a quickie. So why don't we open it up to questions and comments if you'd like.
Absolutely, boy. I mean, you are I don't know what call encyclopedia is the right word of history and personalities over such a long period of time, and it's great that you were able to document a lot of this stuff in your Weird Palm Beach books. One thing I wondered about was, considering that you had 30 years at the Post, as I'm not putting you on the spot, but what would you say were the biggest sort of differences in the life and focus as a reporter between when you started and when you left? So that was 1987.
Well, ironically, it's two different directions. The population of Palm Beach County is much larger than it was when I started in 1987. We're up to 1.7 million, I think. Sadly, the circulation of the Palm Beach Post is down to, I think, about 40,000. And when you think about that, what that means is that even if you take away the babies and people who don't speak English or read English, it means that maybe like 1 million people in Palm Beach County that don't get any local news, which is very scary. When I first got there, we had about 500 employees. We had, I think, 10 bureaus. We had a bureau in Delray, bureau in Palm Beach Gardens, 2 bureaus in the Treasure Coast. Our Delray bureau, I worked in the Delray bureau for a while, it had 17 people. We had a bureau in Belglade, bureau in Okeechobee. We had a 5-man bureau in Tallahassee. Cox had a 20-person bureau in Washington. All gone. I don't have to tell you that we don't cover Lake Worth and Lantana all the time. We just don't have enough people. And you know, when I do talks, I'm like, folks, we're not covering those towns, but things are happening. And it's not just like everybody's, you know, obviously, you know, they're like, well, without a local newspaper, politicians are going to do things they're going to do things wrong and get away with them. Again, sorry, Mayor. And not all politicians will do it, but some politicians will if there's nobody keeping them to task. But it's far more than that. A newspaper is the glue of a community. And as much as writing about some elected official who did something wrong, it's also writing about what time is the turkey dinner and what's the parade route and who won that contest drawing the paintings on the sidewalk in Lake Worth and what's going on with that baseball stadium that they're building in Jupiter. Those are the kind of things that when there's no newspaper, you're not going to find out at all, which is very scary. So that was the most dramatic thing about my tenure at the paper, was just how everything changed, and really changed pretty rapidly.
Wow, that's a kind of a sad commentary on being able to keep up with what's going on in the world today, I must say. I got
Eliot, if you would like to stop your screen share, the number of people on this call we can see on one screen, and it might help us have a good conversation. You can click on gallery view if you like and see everybody that's on the call, and then people can raise their hands.
There you go.
Questions that might facilitate the conversation.
All right.
Well, I have a question about Chillingworth, and it's a very vague one because I don't remember exactly what my neighbor said. But we live on South Lakeside Drive, on south of downtown along the intercoastal, and a neighbor said that Chillingworth owned a property maybe in about the 1300 block, and it's a lot that's still empty. It's been built up on either side, but it's an older lot, and I was wondering if you knew anything about a Lake Worth connection with Chillingworth.
I don't, but it wouldn't surprise me because he certainly had a lot of real estate, so it's quite possible.
You know, I have another question, which is in your weird Palm Beach books. Of course, most of the well, maybe it's perspective, but has the concept of sort of interesting villains sort of declined over the years? I mean, seems like most of these interesting characters were in the 20s and 30s and maybe into the 40s and 50s, and we don't seem to have those sort of interesting semi-sympathetic villains anymore, or maybe you can cite a couple of examples.
Well, again, I think a lot of it is because the passage of time. I went back and read articles when the Ashley Gang was in their prime, and they were not heroes to most people. But you look back at 60, 70, 80, 90 years later, and it's all very romantic. Again, you have to remember that during Prohibition, roles were reversed. The cops were the bad guys because they were taking away your liquor, and the rum runners and moonshiners were giving the people what they wanted. Prohibition was a very unpopular law. And by the way, almost a joke here in Florida. It was not hard to get a drink in South Florida at all. In fact, one of the hotels, I think it was the Royal Poinciana, had a secret hallway that led to a secret room, and they called it Hypocrites Row. And I loved it so much. It's the title of one of the novels. I wrote a novel in which I created a 1920s Miami police detective. And the novel is called Hypocrites Row because I just love that line. But again, a lot of these people were what you would call anti-heroes in that in this weird role reversal, they were just, they were doing what, the public wanted. But I can tell you that I have read up on, when these rum runners and prohibition guys would kill a policeman, there was a guy who lived in a house which is now a dentist office about 2 blocks north of where the Palm Beach Post is now. And in January of 1930, 2 federal prohibition agents knocked on his door to serve an arrest warrant. And he shotgunned them, killed both of them. So I discovered this in the clips, and I'm like, holy cow. So one of these, I said, I got to find, relatives of these guys. So one of them had a very unusual name, Moncure, Moncure. This is in the early stages of the internet when you had to get your librarian to look stuff up on the internet. We weren't trusted to the internet. And I said, Sammy, can you look on the internet and see if anywhere in the country there's somebody with the same name as this guy? And she calls me back 5 minutes later. She says, you might have wanted to look at the Boca Raton phone book because Moncure's grandson, Robert Moncure III, easy to find, was an insurance agent in Boca Raton. And I called him up and he said, oh, absolutely. And then he said something that as a historian, when somebody says this to you, your knees start to knock. He says, I got a whole box under the bed. And in this box were letters that his grandmother wrote to her husband after he was killed. Now, you would think that this is ghoulish. It was heartbreaking. And he let us use all the letters. And we put it in the paper, and people were just like calling us up, just weeping. Because, she said all those prohibition rum runners and smugglers, they claim to be heroes. As people like my husband supposedly are the bad guys. Well, now my husband's dead. You murdered him. So thanks a lot. It was very powerful.
Wow. Interesting. Another thing I wondered about is now you have segued away from, I guess you could say, news and reporting to fiction. And you have, I guess, currently about to be published a novel that has to do with the end of the Civil War, if I got that right. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why you got into that?
Well, as far as it being published, I'm still waiting to find somebody who will publish it. Still working on that. I always wanted to write fiction. In fact, I thought when I was in college, I thought I wanted to go write novels and become a millionaire, novelist, which thank goodness I didn't. Thank goodness I got a day job because I don't think I'd have done too well. But I always wanted to write. I wrote a dozen nonfiction books, and I love them. I wrote the 2 books that were collections of the Post Time columns. I wrote 3 books with the Palm Beach Post that we wrote as a team about the history of Palm Beach County. I did a book length collection of my stories about World War II in Florida, which, as you know, the U-boats were sinking ships right off the coast of Lake Worth, right off the pier. And I wrote a book on the great 1928 hurricane, which I call the most underreported natural disaster in the history of the United States. It killed more people than any hurricane in history, except the Galveston hurricane of 1900, but nobody ever heard about it. And I said right in the front of the book that it mostly killed poor Black migrant workers. And if it had killed 3,000 white businessmen in downtown West Palm, or if it would have smashed a black tie affair out on the island, they'd still be talking about it. So I wrote all these nonfiction books, but I always had a place, I always wanted to do fiction. So even before I retired, I was already playing around with this book. And it's a historical novel that is based at the end of the Civil War, in which a guy runs a stockyard in Chicago, and his son's kind of a ne'er-do-well. His wife died of typhoid when the son was a little kid. So the son's grown up without a mother, and he's become quite the he's just a ne'er-do-well. So the stockyard owner's got a brother who runs a cattle ranch down in Southwest Florida. And the war ends, and he doesn't know what's going on with his brother, so he sends his young son to go down with some occupation troops to find out what the heck's happening with his uncle. Now, in the meantime, there was an immigrant from Europe who had come over to work in the stockyards and who had killed a man in self-defense during a fight. And he was forced to go to war for the ne'er-do-well son so that the son could party during the whole Civil War. So at the end of the Civil War, this ne'er-do-well son goes down to Florida to find out what's going on with his uncle's ranch, and he finds out his uncle's been murdered. And he knows immediately who did it. And he knows that he has to find this immigrant in order to redeem himself and to get justice for his family. That's all I'm going to tell you.
So we'll have to wait for publication. Well, anyway, listen, it's really been a pleasure to get a little sample of the incredible range of material that you have developed up to this point, I should say, in your career as a reporter and a writer. Certainly, you are I guess the right word is a regional, state, and historical resource that we're lucky to be able to tap, and we really hope that you keep at it. And thanks a lot for entertaining us tonight. And for the rest of you, we look forward to our presentation next month, and we'll be in touch by email, Facebook, and our website. So thanks a lot, and good evening.